The chamber fell into an eerie silence, the kind you could feel in your bones. The light from the overhead chandeliers cast a harsh glow across the rows of faces, polished, tired, indifferent. The whispers in the room had faded into nothing, replaced by a heavy tension. Rand Paul stood at the podium, his expression cold, calculating. The camera zoomed in on his eyes, sharp and unyielding. He was ready for battle. With a deliberate, almost theatrical breath, he leaned into the microphone. And then, in a voice that sliced through the air like a blade, he spoke. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Jasmine," Rand Paul sneered, his words dripping with disdain. "You come in here, with all your ideals and no understanding of the reality that drives this country. Your policies, your fantasies, are not only impractical, they're dangerous." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jasmine Crockett, sitting a few feet away, stiffened. Her jaw tightened, but her gaze never wavered from Paul. The weight of his insult was not just a political jab, it was personal. Every word he spat was a challenge, an attempt to tear her down in front of the entire country. The audience in the chamber shifted uncomfortably. But Crockett? She remained still, poised, her face betraying nothing but quiet determination. She had been through worse. Much worse. The tension in the room thickened, as if the world outside had stopped turning, waiting for the next move. Rand Paul didn't stop there. His voice grew louder, more venomous, as he laid out his case against her. Each word was an attack. Each phrase designed to belittle her, to prove that someone like her, someone who had risen from nothing, wasn't qualified to challenge the establishment. But as his voice echoed in the chamber, something changed in the air. A murmur rippled through the crowd, an almost imperceptible shift. Those who had once been loyal to him began to shift in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Crockett's calm was unsettling. Her silence was speaking louder than any retort ever could. And then, just when Paul seemed certain that he had her on the ropes, something happened. Something no one, not even his closest allies, could have predicted. But what happened next left even his most loyal supporters stunned. The room fell even quieter. The stage was set, not just for a political debate, but for a clash of ideologies that would define the future of American democracy. On one side, there was Jasmine Crockett, a rising star whose voice had become synonymous with hope for marginalized communities, the ones who had long been left behind. She wasn't just a politician, she was a movement. Every word she spoke resonated with those who had been silenced for too long. Her journey had been anything but easy. From growing up in the underserved neighborhoods of Dallas to standing in the hallowed halls of Congress, she had always fought for the people who needed her most. Her rise to power was a testament to what America was supposed to represent, the possibility that anyone, regardless of background, could ascend through hard work in the pursuit of justice. But what she truly represented, what her very presence in Congress signified, was the belief that the American dream wasn't just about individual success, it was about collective progress. It was about making sure that every person had an equal shot at dignity, at healthcare, at a fair chance. And in that chamber, under the bright lights, Jasmine Crockett was the embodiment of that hope. But standing against her was Rand Paul, a seasoned politician from Kentucky who had made a name for himself by fiercely defending libertarian principles. He was a product of the establishment, a figure who thrived on the status quo, on the illusion that the old ways were the best ways. His ideology wasn't about progress, it was about preserving what had already been built. And to him, the system worked just fine for the people at the top. To him, Crockett's progressive vision was a threat to the very foundation of what he considered American greatness. But it was more than just a political squabble. It was a battle for the soul of America. Crockett's vision was one where justice, equality, and opportunity were the cornerstones of society. Where every American, regardless of race, class, or background, had a seat at the table. Where healthcare wasn't a privilege, but a right. Where education wasn't dependent on how much money your parents had, but on your potential. Paul, on the other hand, represented the entrenched powers that had ruled the political landscape for decades. He was the defender of a system that had worked for the wealthy and powerful but left everyone else to fend for themselves. This was the defining moment, the standoff that would shape the future of politics in America. And yet, most people didn't realize how much was truly at stake. In that room, where words were weapons, the future of the nation hung in the balance. What was happening wasn't just a heated debate, it was a defining moment in the struggle between two worlds, the world of progress and justice, and the world of privilege and partisanship. As the days leading up to the debate had unfolded, Crockett had become the voice of the new generation, one that demanded accountability, transparency, and fairness. She had ignited a fire in the hearts of millions who felt left behind, who were tired of empty promises and political games. Her rise wasn't just about one woman in a seat of power, it was a signal to the country that change was possible, that it was already happening. And that was why Rand Paul's attack on her wasn't just a personal affront, it was an attack on everything she stood for. It was an attempt to crush the movement, to silence the voices that had finally found their strength. In that chamber, he wasn't just going after a fellow politician, he was going after the very heart of the hope that so many had placed in Crockett's vision. But Crockett wasn't backing down. She wasn't about to let the old guard define the narrative. This debate wasn't just a contest of ideas, it was a battle for the future of the country. And as the room simmered with tension, it was clear, this was bigger than any one person. The question wasn't whether Crockett could win this debate, it was whether the vision she carried in her heart could withstand the weight of the forces lined up against her. This was more than just another political squabble, it was a confrontation between two worlds. One where justice, progress, and inclusivity stood on one side, and the other, a vision mired in partisanship and privilege. Rand Paul had always liked to think of himself as a man of principles. He spoke of liberty, freedom, and individual rights with the kind of fervor that could convince you he was on a quest for justice. The only problem? His version of liberty had very little room for anyone who wasn't already part of the privileged class. His principles weren't about equality, they were about preserving the status quo, and that status quo just so happened to benefit him, and people like him, immensely. Born into wealth and political lineage, Rand Paul had never been a man who truly knew struggle. His father, the former congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul, had been a fixture in the libertarian movement, advocating for policies that often seemed more concerned with the individual's right to do whatever they wanted than with collective responsibility. And as the heir to that legacy, Rand Paul had inherited more than just his father's name, he inherited a worldview that seemed stuck in a time when the biggest threat to America was a government that interfered too much with business, or an IRS agent daring to knock on the door of someone who might have a few too many zeros in their bank account. It was the kind of thinking that made him blind to the struggles of people who didn't live in gated communities, who didn't have the luxury of health insurance and private schools. His philosophy didn't account for the fact that not everyone had the same starting point in life. While the average American family struggled to put food on the table, Rand Paul was busy railing against the minimum wage and the idea that there should be any collective effort to help those in need. His brand of freedom, you see, only worked if you already had a seat at the table. If you didn't, well, that was your problem. And Rand Paul was nothing if not consistent in his contradictions. In one breath, he would demand that government stay out of our lives and stop interfering, but in the next, he would throw his support behind corporate tax cuts that only benefited the wealthiest Americans. He railed against regulation, yet never seemed to mind that those same corporations were polluting the air and water, or that pharmaceutical companies were jacking up the prices of life-saving medications. It didn't matter to him, his world was one of unchecked capitalism, where people should simply pull themselves up by their bootstraps, regardless of whether they even had boots to begin with. His tendency to condescend and belittle those who dared to challenge his worldview had become legendary in Washington. He wasn't just dismissive of opposing viewpoints, he made it a point to destroy anyone who didn't subscribe to his narrow vision of the world. He mocked the idea that healthcare was a right, laughed off the notion that wages should rise with inflation, and rolled his eyes at the very thought of universal education. His approach was always the same: if you didn't agree with him, you were either ignorant or un-American. Take, for instance, his behavior during the debate over healthcare reform. When the Affordable Care Act was on the table, Rand Paul was one of the loudest voices calling for its repeal, dismissing the millions of Americans who depended on it as lazy, entitled, or misinformed. He'd call them victims of government overreach, as if it were the government's fault that so many couldn't afford the basic human right to health. His libertarian ideals were fine and dandy when it was someone else's problem, but they fell apart the moment real human lives were on the line. Rand Paul's arrogance wasn't just a personal trait, it was baked into his political persona. He had no interest in listening to those who disagreed with him. His conversations were always one-sided, a constant stream of self-righteous tirades aimed at fixing the country according to his very narrow definition of what was right. For him, compromise was weakness, and dialogue was an inconvenience. He preferred to ignore the facts that didn't fit into his neatly constructed narrative. What made him particularly insufferable to his critics was his ability to maintain an air of calm, even smug, self-assurance. He never raised his voice or lost his composure, but his words were sharp and cutting. They came across as carefully crafted, delivered with the cold confidence of someone who had been in the political game for decades and who had seen it all. It was the perfect cover for his true agenda, defending the rich and powerful, while pretending to be a man of the people. Paul had always prided himself on his principles, but those principles were more about defending the rich and powerful than addressing the real issues facing the American people. His words may have sounded smooth, but they were dripping with the arrogance of someone who had never had to fight for a fair shot. He was the embodiment of the old political guard, the kind of politician who thrived in a system that catered to the wealthy, the corporate elite, and the status quo. He didn't understand that, for the millions of Americans struggling to make ends meet, the idea of freedom meant something very different. It was this mindset, this blatant disregard for the realities of most Americans, that made Rand Paul the perfect villain for this moment in history. He wasn't just wrong, he was blind to the suffering he was perpetuating. His entire career had been a battle to maintain the privileges of a select few, and now, here he was, facing a woman who represented everything he stood against. His arrogance had driven him to this moment, this attack on Jasmine Crockett, believing, as always, that his way was the only way. But he had underestimated her. He had underestimated the people she represented. And most importantly, he had underestimated the power of truth. But in that chamber, with the spotlight on him, Rand Paul would soon discover that no amount of arrogance could defeat the force of justice. Jasmine Crockett didn't grow up in the halls of power. She didn't come from a legacy of privilege or a family that had always had a seat at the table. She was born into a world that wasn't kind to people who looked like her. In the neighborhoods of Dallas, where opportunity was a distant dream for many, Jasmine learned early on that the fight for justice wasn't just a fight, it was a way of life. Her mother worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table, her father was absent for much of her childhood, leaving her to take on the weight of responsibility for herself and her younger siblings. But no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much effort was put in, they were still just a few wrong turns away from disaster. It was a system that had no mercy for the struggling, no room for people like Jasmine to thrive. She knew that feeling all too well, the feeling of being overlooked, discounted, and left to fend for herself in a world that seemed to want to crush her spirit. But Jasmine Crockett was never one to back down. She wasn't someone who would let the world write her off. She knew from the very beginning that the fight for her life was a fight for everyone like her. As a child, she'd learned the power of words. Jasmine's grandmother had always been her greatest inspiration. "Your voice is your strength, Jasmine," she'd say, every time the world made her feel small. "Don't you dare let anyone silence you. You have a right to be heard." Those words stayed with her, ingraining themselves into the fabric of who she was. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the people who didn't have a voice, for the people who had been silenced by a system that was rigged against them. She excelled in school, not because things were easy, but because she worked relentlessly, day in and day out. Education was her escape, her pathway out of the cycle of poverty that threatened to swallow her whole. But it wasn't just academics that fueled her, Jasmine had an innate sense of justice that was impossible to ignore. Even in her early years, she stood up for classmates who were bullied, she protested injustices she saw, and she fought for fairness when no one else was willing to. Her journey to law school was no different. It wasn't handed to her. She had to fight every step of the way. Scholarships were hard to come by, and the road to becoming a lawyer was filled with obstacles designed to stop her. But every setback made her more determined. There was no room for quitting in Jasmine Crockett's world. It was in law school that her passion for civil rights and justice took root. She saw firsthand how systemic racism, ingrained in every aspect of American society, was keeping millions of people, especially black and brown communities, marginalized. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't just sit in a classroom and learn about the law without feeling compelled to use it as a tool for change. And so, after graduating, she dove headfirst into the fight. She began representing people who couldn't afford lawyers, fighting for the voiceless and the forgotten. She took on cases that others dismissed as lost causes, and in the process, earned a reputation as someone who fought tooth and nail for justice. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just going to work within a broken system, she was going to tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. Her entry into politics was not a move of convenience, but a calling. She had seen the system up close, the corruption, the exploitation, the disregard for the people who needed help the most. She knew that the way to truly make a difference was from within. Crockett didn't enter politics to gain power or fame. She entered politics to change the lives of people like her, people who had been abandoned by the system for too long. Her voice became louder, her presence more undeniable. When she spoke, people listened, not just because she was a politician, but because she was the voice of the people who had been forgotten. She wasn't just a representative, she was their champion. Her rise wasn't without its challenges. Being a woman of color in politics came with its fair share of hurdles, racism, sexism, and a level of scrutiny that far surpassed that of her colleagues. Yet, every time the world tried to tear her down, Jasmine Crockett rose higher. She carried with her the struggles of every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, that their voices didn't matter. Crockett was a walking testament to the idea that no matter how many times life knocked you down, you could always get back up, stronger, fiercer, and more determined than ever. Her integrity was the foundation of her career. Jasmine wasn't in it for the power, the perks, or the prestige. She was in it to make real, tangible change for the people who needed it most. When other politicians took the easy way out, when they catered to the interests of the powerful, Crockett remained true to her mission. She fought for healthcare as a right, for better wages for working-class families, for education reform that ensured every child, no matter where they came from, had the chance to succeed. Her connection to the people was unwavering, she didn't just represent them, she was them. In Congress, Jasmine Crockett became a voice that demanded change. A voice that couldn't be ignored. And it was this voice, the voice of a woman who had fought every obstacle life threw at her, that would soon face the arrogant, dismissive tirade of Rand Paul. But what Crockett knew, what she had always known, was that the fight for justice wasn't a fight for the faint of heart. It was a fight for the brave. And she was more than ready for the battle ahead. From her humble beginnings, Jasmine Crockett had fought against every obstacle life threw at her. She wasn't just a representative, she was a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of integrity in a system built on exploitation. The tension in the chamber was palpable, a simmering cauldron just waiting to boil over. Every eye was on Rand Paul as he stood tall, leaning into his microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. He was no stranger to these debates, but this time, his target was different. This time, it was Jasmine Crockett, and he had made it his mission to break her down. You see, this is the problem with people like Jasmine Crockett, folks, he began, his tone slick, calculating. They think they know how the world works, but the reality is they've never been on the ground, doing the real work. They talk a big game about equality, about fairness, but when it comes to understanding how our economy works, how the free market works, well, they've got it all wrong. The words hung in the air like a slap. The audience shifted, some nodding in agreement, others clearly uncomfortable with the attack. But Crockett? She didn't flinch. Her expression remained steady, calm, unwavering. She had been here before, too many times to count. She knew this game. Rand Paul was a seasoned politician who thrived on division and disrespect, but Jasmine Crockett had something he couldn't touch: integrity. And she wasn't about to let him strip that away with empty rhetoric. "Senator," Crockett replied, her voice firm yet measured, "you speak about the free market as if it's a savior for all. But the truth is, the system you defend isn't working for the people I represent. It's working for the privileged few. And you, Senator, are one of them." A murmur rippled through the room. The tension thickened, as if the very walls themselves were closing in. Rand Paul's face tightened, but he refused to back down. "You can't possibly understand the nuances of economic policy if all you've ever done is." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he gestured toward her. "Pander to your base, which seems to thrive on handouts and entitlement," he sneered, his voice laced with disdain. "You want to fix America? Start by understanding the basics of economics." The word stung, not just because of the insult, but because of the arrogance behind them. He wasn't just attacking Crockett's policies, he was attacking her very character, dismissing her as a mere figurehead of some imagined, lazy crowd. He was reducing her to nothing more than a stereotype, a target for his condescending scorn. But Crockett stood unshaken. Her eyes never left his, steady, piercing. She wasn't just responding to his insults, she was exposing them for what they were: desperate attempts to mask the truth. "Senator, you've spent your career looking down on people like me. People who don't have the luxury of inheriting wealth or power. But the truth is, you don't get to decide what's basic or not," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a hot knife through butter. "You want to talk economics? Let's talk about the millions of Americans who can't afford the healthcare you've voted against year after year. Let's talk about the families drowning in student debt, while you hand tax cuts to corporations that don't even need them." A collective gasp swept through the chamber. The audience was on edge, the tension now boiling over as Paul's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His eyes flickered with irritation, his fingers gripping the sides of the podium, knuckles whitening. He wasn't used to this: someone standing up to him, someone challenging his every word with the force of truth. "Your way," Crockett continued, "has led to decades of people being left behind. But I'm here to tell you, we don't need more empty promises. We need action. We need leadership that actually listens to the people it claims to serve." With every word, Crockett seemed to grow in stature, her confidence unshaken, while Rand Paul's composure began to crack. He stammered for a moment, trying to regain his ground, but the damage was already done. The more he tried to belittle her, the more childish and petty his attack seemed. He was flailing, and he knew it. "You think you have the answers?" Paul's voice raised now, the cracks in his facade finally showing. "You think you're the only one who cares about this country? I've spent my entire career." "Career?" Crockett interrupted, her words sharp but not harsh. "You've spent your career protecting the wealthy, Senator. You've spent your career defending a broken system. But don't mistake my commitment to justice for naivety. I'm here to make sure that the voices you ignore are finally heard." Her calmness was infuriating to him, her poise a stark contrast to the growing frustration on his face. The audience could feel it, too, the shift in the atmosphere, the way Crockett seemed to rise above his petty barbs, while he, the seasoned politician, could barely hold his ground. It was clear now, this wasn't just a debate. This was a battle of wills, and Rand Paul, for all his arrogance and experience, was beginning to lose. Every attempt to undermine her only made her look stronger, more resolute, while his attacks made him seem increasingly out of touch, increasingly desperate. Paul's words grew more biting with every sentence, but Crockett remained unshaken, her eyes never leaving his as if daring him to show more of his true self. She wasn't just standing up for her policies, she was standing up for the very soul of the country, for the future that so many had been denied. And that, more than anything, was the real threat to Rand Paul. The room had reached a boiling point. The tension in the chamber felt as if it could snap at any moment, with both sides locked in a battle of egos, principles, and ideologies. Rand Paul's face was flushed with frustration, his voice increasingly shrill as he flung insult after insult at Jasmine Crockett. But as the chaos swirled around her, she stood still, calm and composed. Her gaze never left Paul, and though the world around her seemed to quake with energy, she was the eye of the storm. Her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't rattled, she was waiting for the perfect moment. And then it came. With a measured breath, Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice soft yet firm. It cut through the cacophony in the chamber like a scalpel, so precise, so deliberate, that the room went quiet almost instantly. The audience, the journalists, and even her colleagues on the floor were hanging on every word. "Senator," she began, her tone cool but cutting. "You've been up here lecturing us about what's best for the country, about your vision of freedom and opportunity. But let's be real for a moment. Let's talk about the kind of freedom you're actually defending." Paul's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't prepared for her to turn his own rhetoric against him, to dismantle his narrative with surgical precision. Freedom, Senator, is not a tax break for the wealthy. Freedom is not stripping away the healthcare from millions of people who can't afford their medication. Freedom is not making it harder for people to get a decent education, or to even survive in a system stacked against them. The words hit with the weight of a hammer. Paul tried to interrupt, but Crockett was on fire now, her voice unwavering. Freedom, Senator, she continued, is not telling a single mother in Texas that her child's asthma is her problem, because you've blocked funding for public health. You speak of liberty, but what liberty does she have when she's forced to choose between putting food on the table and paying for her child's treatment? What freedom do the millions of families like hers have when their voices are drowned out by the very system you defend? The room was still. The silence was deafening. Crockett wasn't done. You talk about personal responsibility and individual freedoms, but what do those mean when you've built a system where only the rich get to thrive and the rest of us are left to pick up the scraps? Her voice wasn't raised, but every word felt like a lightning strike. What responsibility do you have to the people of this country if you're too busy protecting billionaires and corporations, turning a blind eye to the struggles of the working class? What kind of freedom is that? Rand Paul was visibly rattled now. His lips tightened, but he said nothing. His usual condescending demeanor was replaced with a thin veneer of frustration. He had nothing to say to that. And that, right there, was Crockett's victory. You claim to be for freedom, Crockett went on, now pausing, her eyes locking onto Paul's with the intensity of someone who had heard enough. But what freedom does a child in Flint have when their water is poisoned, Senator? What freedom do they have when they can't even trust the water they drink, the air they breathe? What kind of freedom are you fighting for when you'd rather preserve the status quo than save the lives of the people who've been forgotten? The words echoed in the chamber like thunder. The crowd was speechless. Rand Paul looked as though he had been struck, caught off guard, speechless for the first time in the entire debate. His arrogance seemed to falter, and his eyes darted around the room, as if searching for any support. But there was none. Crockett didn't pause. She kept going, her voice rising just enough to punctuate her point. You talk about the importance of government being small, of getting the government out of people's lives. But the truth is, Senator, what you really mean is that you want the government out of the lives of the people who need it the most. You want to shrink the government so it doesn't have to protect those who have been left behind by the very system you defend. And you've got the gall to stand here and lecture us on freedom? The air in the room crackled with disbelief. What had been a cacophony of insults and tired talking points from Paul was now reduced to nothing but empty air. Every word Crockett spoke was a direct challenge to the heart of his political philosophy, exposing not just his policy failures, but the moral rot behind them. Rand Paul stood frozen. His mouth opened, as if he were about to speak, but the words never came. His usual charm, his polished rhetoric, had crumbled in the face of Crockett's truth. The audience could feel it, could feel that Paul, for all his years of political experience, had been bested by a woman who had fought her way to this moment, who had seen the devastation caused by people like him. And then, she dropped the final bombshell. "Let me be clear, Senator, I don't just want a government that works for the people. I want a government that sees the people. And right now, this country is at a crossroads. We can continue down the path you've laid out, where the rich get richer and the rest of us drown in debt, poverty, and despair. Or we can choose a future where every single American has the opportunity to thrive, where healthcare, education, and opportunity are not privileges, but rights." The room was dead silent. Even the reporters in the back had stopped typing, their pens hovering in midair. No one had ever heard a response like this. Crockett had not just won the argument, she had turned the debate into something far more profound. She had exposed Paul not just as a political opponent, but as a man whose policies had failed millions. She had exposed him for what he truly was, a defender of the status quo, a man more interested in preserving his power than in making a real difference. In that moment, it was clear. Jasmine Crockett had not just countered his arguments. She had obliterated them. The silence hung in the air, and for the first time in the entire debate, Rand Paul had no answer. No response. He was lost. The moment was everything. Jasmine Crockett had delivered the crushing blow, and the world knew it. Her words would echo far beyond the chamber, and soon, social media would explode with praise. Memes. Tweets. Hashtags like #Crockett for the win would flood timelines. She wasn't just a politician. She was a force. And in that silence, the room knew, this wasn't just a debate. This was a reckoning. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her mic-drop counterattack, the world seemed to pause. In that instant, the political landscape had irrevocably shifted. What had been a heated debate in a chamber now exploded into a viral firestorm that would take over every news cycle, every social media platform, and leave Rand Paul's reputation in tatters. Within seconds, the silence in the room was replaced by an electric hum, a wave of disbelief spreading across the audience. Reporters scrambled to tweet their reactions, capturing every word of Crockett's takedown. But it wasn't just the press. The people, the millions watching at home, were about to make their voices heard in a way that would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. Social media erupted. It started with a tweet from a major political pundit: "Jasmine Crockett just dismantled Rand Paul in a way no one saw coming. This is what real leadership looks like. #Crockett for the win." Within minutes, the hashtag Crockett for the win began to trend. It wasn't just trending in Washington, D.C., or across political circles, it was dominating the conversation in living rooms across America. People from every walk of life began to share the clip of Crockett's rebuttal, the part where she took Paul to task for his hollow rhetoric, exposing the moral bankruptcy of his policies. Celebrities, activists, and influencers alike were quick to chime in. Rihanna tweeted, "Just watched at Jasmine Crockett on C-SPAN, she's not just a politician, she's a force. The truth just spoke loud and clear. #Crockett for the win." The tweet garnered millions of likes and retweets, flooding timelines with praise for the Congresswoman's powerful words. LeBron James added, "That's leadership. Crockett spoke for all of us today. #Crockett for the win." In the wake of Crockett's flawless rebuttal, influencers across social media platforms picked up on the momentum. Memes were made, GIFs of Crockett standing strong, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to Paul's frustration, were shared across Instagram and TikTok. Even late-night comedians had something to say. On The Daily Show, Trevor Noah quipped, "If this was a boxing match, Rand Paul's corner would have thrown in the towel. That was a knockout, folks. Jasmine Crockett just ended the fight with one punch." The crowd went wild, and so did the internet. But it wasn't just celebrities making noise. Ordinary citizens, the people Crockett fought for every day, were posting their reactions, their support for the underdog who had finally broken through the corporate-funded establishment with unshakable truth. A high school teacher from Milwaukee tweeted, "I've been teaching my students about the importance of standing up for what's right. Today, I have a real-life example. Thank you, Jasmine Crockett, for showing us all what it means to fight for our future." Hashtag Crockett for the win. Hashtag Crockett for the win was everywhere. It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a movement. News outlets began to pick up on the viral explosion, their headlines reflecting the seismic shift happening in real time. Crockett's mic drop moment goes viral, shatters Paul's arguments. Interviews with political analysts echoed the same sentiment. What Crockett had done wasn't just win a debate. She had won the moral high ground. She had shown that truth, when spoken with unwavering conviction, could topple the lies of the establishment. As the news cycle shifted, Paul's allies started to distance themselves from him. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Commentary from conservative pundits tried to downplay the moment, but it was clear, Crockett's words had struck a nerve. And even though some tried to shrug off the significance of the debate, the American people had already decided who the real winner was. The ripple effect was undeniable. The political establishment, those who had long overlooked Crockett as just another voice in the noise, now had to reckon with her power. Her name was now synonymous with truth and integrity. Politicians on both sides of the aisle took to their own social media platforms to voice their admiration. Elizabeth Warren, a fierce progressive ally, tweeted, "This is what courage looks like. Jasmine Crockett just delivered a masterclass in leadership. Let's make sure we all follow her lead." But it wasn't just the liberals who were acknowledging Crockett's dominance. Even Mitt Romney expressed his respect, writing, "Politics aside, Jasmine Crockett showed remarkable poise today. A strong message for all of us." It was rare for anyone to praise a member of the opposing party like that, but Crockett had done something that transcended partisan lines. She had spoken truth to power in a way that made even her fiercest opponents take notice. By the time the evening news hit, the hashtag was plastered across TV screens. Hashtag Crockett for the win had gone global. Her speech was replayed in countless newscasts. Clips of her calm, composed delivery, dismantling Paul's arguments, were played on a loop. She wasn't just a politician, she was a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of what could happen when someone who had always been pushed aside, always been told they didn't belong, finally stood up and said, "Enough." And the more people watched, the more they rallied behind her. The truth she spoke reverberated beyond Washington, striking a chord with those who had been overlooked, marginalized, and ignored for far too long. They saw in Crockett the voice they had been waiting for, the one who would not just challenge the system, but change it. The political establishment, having underestimated Crockett's influence, was now forced to reckon with the reality that her moment had arrived. She wasn't just a voice in the crowd anymore, she was the voice. The truth had been spoken, and the people had heard it. As social media exploded with hashtag Crockett for the win, it was clear, this was only the beginning. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a movement, and America was listening. As the dust settled and the applause echoed in the chambers of Congress, Jasmine Crockett stood there, not as the victor of a single debate, but as a beacon of something far greater. The victory wasn't hers alone, it was the victory of every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told they didn't matter. It was the victory of those who had longed for someone who would not just speak for them, but stand beside them and fight for them with integrity, truth, and unwavering resolve. But it was more than just a political win, it was a call to action. A reminder of why this fight was never about a single person or a single moment. It was about all of us. About the millions of voices that had been drowned out for so long. Crockett knew this was just the beginning, but the message was clear: no matter the obstacles, no matter the system stacked against you, it is always worth it to stand up for what is right. She stepped up to the podium, her calm demeanor now carrying the weight of what she had just accomplished. The weight of an entire nation's hopes, dreams, and aspirations. This was her moment to speak not just to the political elite, but to the people watching at home, the ones who had believed for so long that change was impossible, that the system was too broken to fix. Today, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, wasn't just about a debate. It wasn't about who won or who lost. What happened here today was about something much bigger, the truth. It was about standing up against the corruption that has plagued our system for too long and fighting for a future where all voices are heard, where all people matter, and where justice is not just an ideal, but a reality. Her words rang out, resonating with everyone in the room, and everyone watching. In those few moments, Crockett had reframed the entire conflict. It wasn't just a win for her or for one political party. It was a win for the people. A win for justice. A win for the countless individuals who had never been given a voice in the halls of power. We have been told, Crockett continued, that the system is too broken to fix, that the people in power are untouchable, that change is impossible. But today, we proved them wrong. We proved that the truth is louder than the lies. We proved that standing up for what's right is more powerful than the forces that try to silence us. Her voice grew stronger, more impassioned. But this victory isn't just mine. It's ours. It's the victory of every person who has fought for a better future. It's the victory of every worker who has fought for fair wages, every child who has fought for a better education, every family who has fought for access to healthcare. It's the victory of the people who have been fighting for decades, and who will continue to fight, because the work is never done. Change is not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with us. It starts with all of us standing together. Crockett paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room was silent, the air thick with the realization that something had shifted. That something had been sparked. She had shown the world what could happen when someone refused to back down in the face of injustice, when someone stood up with nothing but their integrity and their truth. What happened today wasn't just about politics, it was about standing up for what's right. We all have the power to make a change, to stand tall in the face of injustice, and to fight for a better, more equitable world. And we can do that, together. The audience sat in stunned silence, their hearts heavy with the realization that what Crockett had just done went far beyond a victory in a political debate. It was a moral victory, one that transcended partisan lines and spoke to something deeper, the fight for justice, for dignity, for equality. Crockett had not just defeated Rand Paul in a battle of words, she had taken a stand for the soul of the nation, for the people who had been ignored and dismissed for far too long. Today, I didn't just speak for myself. I spoke for all of us, she said, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of every person in the chamber, every person who had watched from home, who had believed in her, who had fought beside her. And I promise you this, I will never stop fighting for what's right. I will never stop fighting for you. Because we deserve a future where everyone has the chance to thrive. We deserve a country that doesn't just serve the few, but the many. Crockett took a moment, letting her words resonate. The audience, still in the grip of the emotional wave she had just unleashed, slowly began to stir. The applause started quietly, but it grew louder, reverberating throughout the chamber. People were standing, cheering, not just for Crockett but for what she represented, something far bigger than any individual, any party, any debate. As the applause continued, Crockett smiled, not in pride, but in quiet resolve. This was just the beginning. This was just one battle in a long fight for justice. But in this moment, she had done something far greater than win a debate. She had lit a spark, and that spark was now a flame, one that would grow, spread, and ignite a movement. We all have a role to play in this fight, Crockett concluded. And together, we will make sure that the future we create is one where justice isn't just an ideal, it's a reality for everyone. The room was filled with the sound of applause, but Crockett knew that the real work was just beginning. And she was ready to lead the charge. What we witnessed today wasn't just a debate, it was a moment that will echo through the halls of history. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge the status quo, she exposed it. With unwavering integrity, she stood for what's right, for the people, and for a future where justice isn't just a dream but a reality. Now, it's time for all of us to step up. This moment isn't just about one woman's victory, it's about all of us taking action. It's about showing the world that truth, when spoken with courage and conviction, has the power to change everything. If you believe in what Jasmine Crockett said, if you believe in standing up for what's right, and if you believe in the power of justice, then this is your call to action. Share this video. Share this message. Let the world know that we will no longer sit back while injustice thrives. The fight for a better future doesn't end here, it's just beginning. But it will take all of us. Every one of us has a role to play in this movement for change. So, subscribe to this channel. Join the movement. Let's keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep raising our voices until every single person in this country has the opportunity to live with dignity, equality, and justice. Together, we can make that future a reality. Don't let this moment fade away, be part of the change. The fight for justice is ours to win, and it starts now.